Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. So in this video, as you can probably imagine based on the title, I'm gonna be giving a rough outline of the history of philosophy from a Marxist point of view. And the reason I decided to make this video is that I've kind of studied philosophy on my own for a while now, and eventually I want to start a series of properly researched and scripted videos where I go through the history of philosophy, like each episode would be one philosopher or one school of philosophy or something. But I have so many other projects going on that I simply do not have the time to do that anytime soon. It's not something I plan to do in the near future. And also the history of philosophy is a big topic. It takes a long time to study even one philosopher properly. So, I'm not going to be able to make that series anytime soon. But since I already know a bunch of stuff about philosophy, I thought, why don't I share that? Hopefully it'll be useful to the comrades out there. So this is unscripted. I only have some very rough notes. I'm gonna cover most of the really famous philosophers and their ideas, and I'll probably talk more about the philosophers that I know better. And I'm only going to be covering quote-unquote Western philosophy. I'm not going to talk about the philosophy of like India or China or the Middle East or anything. I'm only going to be talking about mostly Europe. And I'm probably going to piss some people off because I'm going to talk about a lot of philosophers, and one of those is going to be like somebody's favorite philosopher, and then I'm going to criticize them or say that they're wrong about something, and then somebody's going to get upset, but can't be helped. I'm basing what I say on what the Marxist-Leninist literature says, but of course it's only my understanding of that literature, so I might still be wrong about something. Obviously, I don't necessarily remember where I've learned certain things, but I'll put sources in the description as best I can. I think this is going to be interesting for people who are Marxists and maybe are not super well read on philosophy, and then especially the history of philosophy. And I think this is also going to be interesting to people who are maybe knowledgeable about the history of philosophy, but maybe don't know what the Marxist take on it is. And personally, I think that the history of philosophy is one of the most interesting parts of philosophy, because you can see how it evolves, like how ideas change, basically. So the Marxist view is that in the most primitive societies, before there were states, before there were countries, before there was property, when people still lived in very ancient tribal communities, there obviously was no philosophy. There was also no science. There was no religion as we understand it, and there was no art the way we understand it. What I mean by that is that in the earliest societies, those were all one thing. According to Marxism, science, art, religion, politics, etc., they are different ways of cognizing the world, but in the earliest societies, there was only one way of cognizing the world, and it combined everything. So religion had not separated from art, and art had not separated from science. They had not separated from religion, etc. Painting cave paintings was an artistic act, but it was also a religious act, and it was also an act where you tried to gain better hunting results. So it was like a political or an economic act. People made sacrifices to supernatural entities, but to them, that was kind of the same as science. There was no real separation between science and religion and, these different things. And this earliest way of cognizing the world is called religious mythological outlook. When the first states emerge and the first class societies emerge, unfortunately, I don't have time in this video to talk about like how and why that happens, but in the most primitive societies, there were no classes, really. Everybody worked. Everybody performed some kind of work. Of course, there were tribal chiefs. At least eventually there emerged such a thing as a tribal chief. There was no exploitation. Enemies were usually just killed or sent away. Sometimes they were adopted into the tribe. Eventually, productivity of labor increased, and it became possible to utilize slaves so that they would actually produce profit. Originally, that really wasn't possible because it was very difficult for one person to produce enough for several people. So, if you had a slave, the slave would only be able to feed themselves, but there would probably be very little surplus for you. But eventually, slavery becomes a profitable option. First, slavery is used as an auxiliary type of economy, so people still mostly herd cattle or farm or something, and they have a couple slaves on the side. But eventually, slavery becomes a big operation where you have tons of slaves, and then you get this class of slave owners who don't really need to work. They just own slaves. Then the first states emerge. So when the state emerges and when class society emerges, philosophy becomes its own separate field of knowledge. Art also eventually becomes its own separate field of knowledge. So does politics. But science and philosophy don't really become separated yet. In fact, philosophy is at this point called the science of sciences. Even Adam Smith was still called a philosopher and not an economist, even though he was an economist. But I think people at the time didn't really have a concept of a scientist outside of being a philosopher. Aristotle also wrote some stuff about economics, and other philosophers wrote stuff about economics, and Aristotle also wrote a lot on natural science. So even though politics and art and religion, they're all like separate branches of knowledge now, philosophy and science are still kind of intermingled at this point in the earliest states, to the extent that the earliest philosophers, at least in the West, are the Milesian school in Greece in the 6th century BC. The Milesian school is very interesting. They were natural philosophers, which means that they studied nature. So there you can clearly see that natural science and philosophy haven't really separated, because the first kind of philosophy is natural philosophy, which just means studying nature. They mostly just observed and tried to use reasoning to figure out like how the world works, what things are, and etc., etc. Obviously, they didn't really have many scientific instruments. And the Milesian school, because they were natural philosophers and they studied nature, they were materialists. They believed that the world consists of matter. This is something that they don't really teach you in school, but it's very interesting to me that the first kind of philosophy was already materialist. Before that, there was only the mythological worldview, but the first philosophical worldview that emerges is materialism. So members of the Milesian school, they believe that the world is basically material and it's built from basic substances, earth, fire, wind, and water. And they believe that each of those could be transformed into another substance, so that water could become air, and air could become fire, etc., etc. Obviously, this is not the way that we understand the world these days, but that is still a fundamentally materialist way of looking at the world, even though they didn't know about like atoms or electrons or anything like that. And they were very interested in the question, like, which one of these substances is the original or most primary one? They call it the arche. So you've probably heard about these guys like Thales. He was the earliest one. Thales believed that the world consists of water, and I think that his argument was that water can take pretty much any shape. Water evaporates, and he believed that when it's evaporating, it turns into air, and then it rains back down. So rain would be air turning into water. I think they also believed that if you burn things, then they turn from like earth through fire into air, and stuff like that. So there's kind of a logic to it. Obviously, they had very little way of like proving it definitively, but they tried to reason it out. There's a lot of legends about Thales. They said that he was able to predict a solar eclipse. Maybe that's true. He used mathematics. He was interested in natural phenomena. Maybe it's possible. They also say that he was able to predict the weather to an extent. I think he visited Egypt and studied mathematics there. Even though the Milesians were materialists, people sometimes don't realize that because scientific and theoretical philosophical language hadn't really developed enough yet, so they didn't really have proper words to describe certain things. Also, because of the influence of the previous mythological worldview, they had a very sort of mystical and anthropomorphic way of describing natural phenomena. I think it was Thales who said that there's a soul in everything, and he concluded that based on, I think, magnetism. He saw that with magnetism things attract each other, and the only word he could use to describe it was to say that they have a soul. In ancient Greece, they didn't use the word soul in the same meaning that we have today, especially not in the Christian meaning. So they argued like, okay, is wind the prime element, or is water or fire? One of them, Anaximander, made a development. He came closest to the philosophical category of matter, because obviously matter is a philosophical concept. It's not a thing. You can't find a piece of matter. You can only find, a brick or a rock or electrons or something. But you can't find matter in the abstract. Water is something concrete. You can find water, and you can even find hydrogen and things that water consists of, but you can't find matter. In the same way that you can't find fruit, you can only find specific kinds of fruit, but you can't find, a fruit in general. The concept of fruit is a generalization based on different kinds of fruit, like apples and bananas and whatnot. So water is a concrete kind of thing, but Anaximander said that what if there is an original substance and water and fire and earth and air just come from that, so that they have a common original substance, and he called it apeiron, which means infinite and indefinite. And that's a big advance. That's almost what Lenin would say, or what Marx and Engels would say, that matter is infinite, and if it's just matter in the abstract, then it's undefined, like what kind of matter it is. So that was an advance in theoretical reasoning. Okay, moving on. So the first philosophers were materialists, but obviously the idealist school is also going to emerge. Materialists are philosophers who think that matter is primary and that mind is a product of matter, whereas idealists think the opposite. They think that mind is primary, or that spirit is primary, and that matter is a product of the mind. Idealism is just an attempt to theoretically justify religion and superstition, even though idealists might not think that, and they may not be doing it on purpose, but it basically is. The earliest idealist philosophy, I think, was the philosophy of the Pythagoreans. Pythagoras believed that the world consists of numbers, and that mathematical relations exist basically first, and then the world emerges from them. But that's an idealist way of looking at the world, because really numbers didn't exist first. The world existed first, and then we looked at it, and then we invented numbers to explain in words how the world is. First, people saw, okay, I have a bunch of sheep. And then they invented the concept of more sheep or less sheep or same amount of sheep. And then they invented the concept of like, okay, 1 sheep, 2 sheep, and eventually 0 as well. So numbers are not something that exist independently of our mind. Numbers are an invention of our minds to basically explain the world. They do reflect the world, but they're only basically a logical language to explain something. The Pythagoreans were also kind of a religious cult. They were interested in mathematics, but otherwise they were pretty much a religious cult, which is kind of interesting. Another idealist school was the Eleatic school. Famous members of the Eleatic school include Parmenides and Zeno. Parmenides believed that the world is all just one thing, and that all differentiation and all individuality and separateness is just an illusion. He didn't believe that there was any real difference between anything, really. I guess you could say he was like as much of a monist as you could possibly be. Basically, he just thought that everything was spirit, and that's that. And all difference is just an illusion. Everything is fundamentally the same stuff. According to legend, I believe this is what he himself wrote in a poem. He went to a cave and meditated in there for a very long time, and then he saw a goddess, and then the goddess told him that everything is one and that there's no differentiation. But obviously, we've heard this story a million times. Like, what really happened is that he went into a cave, he didn't drink or eat for days, he was exhausted from hunger and thirst, and sensory deprived in a dark cave, and then he had a hallucination. One of the most common types of sort of religious hallucinations. This is what everybody who does like psychedelics or ayahuasca or something says, is that, he saw a vision, and then in the vision he lost his sense of self and everything was one with the universe. But that's how he invented his philosophy. So you can see a radical difference between the materialist philosophers who do science and then idealist philosophers who just go into a cave and trip out. So he's like a hardcore anti-dialectical philosopher in the sense that he doesn't believe in contradiction, because to him everything is one. There can't be a unity of opposites because there is no opposites. There's only unity, but no contradiction for him. His buddy Zeno, on the other hand, was also a very anti-dialectical philosopher. He believed that all change is impossible. So if you've read Anti-Düring, you'll know that Engels talks about the Zeno paradox, or the various kinds of paradoxes. So Zeno invented these paradoxes which were supposed to prove that different kinds of things in the world are contradictory and therefore impossible. Famously, Zeno said that movement is contradictory and therefore movement is impossible. So he said that nothing can change. All change is just an illusion. Engels said that even though Zeno was wrong, and even though Zeno tried to debunk dialectics, he actually advanced dialectics because he did really prove that change and motion are contradictory, but that doesn't mean that they don't happen. It just proves that they're contradictory. So the Eleatic school is a metaphysical, anti-dialectical idealist school. Another ancient Greek philosopher, Heraclitus, he was basically the opposite of the Eleatic school. Heraclitus believed that nothing in the world is constant except change. Lenin and Stalin say that Heraclitus gave basically a primitive definition of dialectical materialism, because Heraclitus, he was a materialist philosopher. He believed that the world is material and consists of the substance fire, and the reason for that is that fire doesn't stand still. It constantly just like jumps around, and Heraclitus said that the world is like a constant burning fire. Sometimes burns brighter, sometimes more dimly, but that's how it is. He said that the world is like an eternally burning fire, and he said that struggle is the mother of all things. I think Heraclitus wrote other books, but the only things that remain from his works are these kinds of aphorisms. So he's a bit of an obscure philosopher because of the subject matter, but also because it's written in aphorisms. He has these really famous aphorisms like, you can never step into the same river twice because the river keeps changing, so if you step into it again, it's a different kind of river. I think one of the most interesting things about ancient Greek philosophy is that, I think it was Lenin who said that in ancient Greece you already had in embryo all the main types of philosophy. You have materialism and idealism, you have dialectics, you have metaphysics, you have people who think that there's only unity, and then there's people who think that there's only disunity or only plurality. And in ancient Greece you also had skeptics who thought that it was impossible to know the world, or that it was impossible to communicate knowledge. And obviously you had the opposite. The ancient materialists thought that it was definitely possible to know the world. I'll also talk about the atomists. So Democritus, who lived in the 400s and 300s BC, he obviously came up with the concept of the atom, which is an indivisible material unit. Sometimes people think that he was the earliest materialist philosopher. That is not the case, but he was still a more advanced materialist philosopher than his predecessors. He was also a dialectical philosopher. Really, all the ancient Greek materialists were quite dialectical because they all saw the world as very fluid and constantly changing, and also as a unity in which there is still contradiction and change. I think Democritus responded to Parmenides when Parmenides said that in the world there's only unity, and because Parmenides didn't believe in opposites, he said that non-existence is not possible. Actually, what he said was that non-existence does not exist, or non-existence cannot exist. And that might sound like just juggling with words, but it's not really. But he tried to use logic, and he said that like non-existence doesn't exist because it's a logical contradiction to say that non-existence exists. Which maybe it is a contradiction to say that non-existence exists, but Democritus, being a dialectical philosopher, responded to him saying that really non-existence does exist because the concept of existence really contains both existence proper and also non-existence. The concept of existence doesn't make any sense without its opposite. And, we know that left doesn't make any sense without the right, and like living doesn't make any sense without death. Like these things, they require, and being a slave doesn't make any sense if slave owners don't exist. These concepts require an opposite to be a real concept. So Democritus believed that the world consists of two things, both of which are part of one unity. So he thought that there's atoms and then the void. The void is basically non-existence, and then in non-existence there are existing atoms. Then I'm going to talk about Socrates and Plato, but not too much. So I believe it was already during the, beginning of the end of the glory days of ancient Greece when Socrates and Plato were around. Socrates, he really changed the game when it comes to philosophy. His focus was mainly on morality and kind of politics, but he didn't really talk about these kinds of ontological things, and he did absolutely no natural philosophy at all. It's a bit difficult for me to separate Plato and Socrates because, Socrates didn't write anything. All the stuff about Socrates is written by Plato, and then Plato also, some of it allegedly happened, and then some of it is just Plato's own views, which are a little different from Socrates. I know a lot about Plato, but his theories are complicated and I don't really have time to go into it, but basically, he was the first idealist to really develop idealism into a full system. Plato is a very interesting philosopher. He is very critical of the old mythological worldview. He's always criticizing the people who just use Homer as an authority. He says that those are basically just myths. They're not good enough. We need theoretical knowledge. We need philosophy. Of course, his philosophy is only an attempt to justify religion, but there is a difference between religion and theories that try to basically make a rational religion. There is a difference between religion and idealism. Plato was not a stupid person. He was a very smart person. He did have a lot of dialectical ideas and even correct ideas, but in the main, he was wrong because he was an idealist, and that's where all of his flaws come from. So his main idea, and also this is interesting, Plato, he was a student of Parmenides, and then he also studied with the Pythagoreans, so that should tell you something. His main idea was that the world is fundamentally spiritual, and that the material world in which we live is really only a shadow or a pale imitation of the real world, which is a spiritual world, and that in the spiritual world there are these forms or ideas which are the real thing. There's the form of a dog, for example, and then all the dogs in the material world are just they're just variations, very poor, low quality variations of the real thing, of the real ideal dog, the form of the dog. Obviously something like a dog is a very trivial example, but that's just an example. So Plato also thought that the world doesn't really change, and that there really isn't any contradiction in the world, because in the ideal world, in the world of the forms, everything is oneness and everything is non-contradictory and everything always stays the same. But in the material world, there's bad things and struggle and contradiction, and things are born and things die and things change. But he believed that was all kind of illusory. His theory of knowledge is that we don't really get knowledge from observations. He thought that we get them through some mystical way. He has this famous idea that the soul already knows everything, but then when the soul is incarnated into a body, into a material body, it forgets everything, but then you can somehow remember. And then obviously when you die, your soul goes to the world of the forms, and then it knows everything again. But I think Plato's real big innovation was his attempt to try to combine separateness and oneness into one thing, because so many of his works are about division of labor. He says that man has a rational side, and then he has a passionate side, and then the rationality has to be in charge of the passions. He says that basically if you only have one part but you don't have the other parts, then it's a very one-sided or lopsided unit. I wish I could think of a good example. Basically, he thinks that society and people and everything else, they are a unity, but they are composed of different complementary parts and also contradicting parts. So this is some of the development that he did, but this is only a detail. Like his basic system is still completely flawed. But Plato's Politics, for example, like he has his famous book, The Republic. In The Republic, he lays out this like supposedly utopian city-state where there's a rigid division of labor. It's basically a caste society where there's a soldier caste and a worker caste and a philosopher caste and etc. etc. And he has all these very extreme views like how art should be banned and that there shouldn't be any property and that the family should be destroyed. And I know somebody's going to say that, that sounds based or whatever, but basically those ideas that there's no property and that there's no family, whatnot, that's just a romanticized view of the primitive society that used to exist in the past, like the primitive tribal society, but he's reimagining it as a golden age. And we also know his views about division of labor and this caste idea. It comes from Egypt. He traveled in Egypt and he was very impressed by their state setup and their economy. And so many of his works are about this idea that, okay, everybody should just stick to the thing they know. And it kind of makes sense. No investigation, no right to speak. So if you don't understand something, you shouldn't be involved in it. But it becomes reactionary when he's basically saying that you're born into it. Like you can't change what job you're doing. You're just born into it, basically. And this idea that in his utopian state, the philosophers are the rulers, that's the same idea as his idea that rationality needs to guide the human body, but he's just implementing that into a state so that in the state, the philosophers are like the rationality and the other people are the body. His successor, one of his students, Aristotle, who Lenin called the greatest philosopher of ancient Greece, for good reason. Aristotle thinks that Plato is smart, but that his basic theory is flawed. Aristotle says that ideas are not really the primary thing. Really, matter is the primary thing. Ideas don't exist independently of matter. Basically, Aristotle, he creates his own theory of the forms, but he just flips it around. He says that it's not that the forms exist and then they become incarnated into material objects. It's the other way around. Material objects exist, and then we create generalizations based on those. We create theoretical concepts based on those. So we see a bunch of different animals. We see a cow, we see a dog, we see a cat, and then we come up with the concept, hey, those are animals. He was very big on categorizing and creating like these families and these categories that have subcategories. But Aristotle is still not a perfectly consistent materialist. Basically, Aristotle's main mistake was that he mostly understood matter as something passive and considered that spirit is some kind of active component, so that the soul is in control of the body and the universe is basically ruled or created by God. Although Aristotle didn't necessarily think that it was chronological, he didn't necessarily think that there was one creation in the past and then that's it. That's more of a Christian medieval interpretation of Aristotle. They tried to incorporate this idea into Christianity, which then allowed Descartes later to use the same idea to argue for deism, to say that, oh yeah, God created everything in the past, but then after that, he doesn't do anything. And he argued against Democritus, who said that the universe has always existed, because Aristotle said that Democritus hasn't explained what created the universe. Well, of course, if the universe has always existed, then it doesn't really need a creator, but Aristotle meant more like, what is the source of the energy, source of the motion, like, where is it coming from? And he said that various explanations of where it comes from just lead to an infinite regress. So therefore he says that there has to be an uncaused cause at the beginning, while Democritus, despite being more correct than Aristotle, didn't really go into the different causes. Democritus just said that there's some kind of almost spontaneous spinning or something of the atoms in the void. but Aristotle's view, it basically is partially a remnant of Plato, but also just like Plato, it's just a reflection of the slave owner ideology, because the slave owners, they don't do any labor, especially not with their physical bodies. So they considered that anybody who does physical work is an inferior person, not really even a person. Slaves were considered just talking machines or talking tools. So that's why Plato develops his idealism, which completely denigrates the material world and physical work. And even though Aristotle is not quite as extreme in that regard as Plato, he still does the same thing. He considers physical work to be inferior, and this also is the flaw in Aristotelian economics. Aristotle cannot understand where value comes from because he doesn't understand that human labor creates value, because he didn't consider the workers, i.e. slaves, to be human beings. Aristotle, he wrote about everything. He wrote about natural science, he wrote about politics, he wrote about economics, he wrote about ethics, he wrote about art and aesthetics. He wrote about every branch of philosophy. Probably most famously on logic. He wrote a lot about logic. He's basically the guy who invented Western formal logic. It's still very valid to this day. He invented the basic philosophical categories that we still use, like quantity and quality and motion and rest and all those things. Even though Aristotle invented formal logic, he still was not an anti-dialectical philosopher. He was a very dialectical philosopher. Dialectical logic is not really against formal logic, it's just a more advanced type of logic. And in fact, in order to be able to develop dialectical logic, you have to have formal logic first. Aristotle saw the world also as changing. He even had this interesting idea of kind of self-motion of matter, because he thought that everything has its own nature and its own sort of purpose that it's pursuing, or basically its own essence that it's unfolding over time. He runs into problems with that, even though that's a very good idea, but it eventually runs into problems because he understands it kind of in a religious way. It becomes teleology. Teleology means goal-oriented, almost like, as if God created cats to eat mice and created mice to be eaten by cats, and that was their purpose and that was their goal, and they were just living towards that goal. Of course, there is no preordained goal. Everything is evolving towards something, but the goal is not planned by any kind of supernatural being. That kind of purposiveness does not exist in history or evolution. Everything is purposive only relatively, like evolution tries to make things that survive better and whatnot. So it's a purpose of that process, kind of within the parameters of that process, but it's not any kind of purpose that's given by an outside deity. Aristotle had an interesting idea of how physical laws work. He tried really to do physics. He thought that the globe is the center of the universe, and he thought that gravity is caused by things going towards the center of the universe. He thought that the nature of rocks is to fall down because that's towards the center of the universe. And rocks are heavier than water, so water floats above the rocks, on top of the rocks, and then air is even lighter, so air hovers above the water. And then he thought that fire is above the air, which is, I guess, kind of like the atmosphere, maybe. Maybe he thought that because of lightning, I don't know. Or maybe just because he couldn't see like fire under any water or under any rocks or something. So he thought that it has to be above them. But in any case, he tried to figure out like a reasonable natural explanation for gravity and those kinds of things, and for mechanics, even though it was mostly like factually wrong from a modern perspective. Unfortunately, he kinda inherits Plato's idea that the world is like divided into two. Like Plato says that there's the ideal world and then there's the material world. Aristotle tries to fix that, but he kind of inherits it a little bit because he believes that natural things have a goal and a nature, but artificial, like man-made things, don't have a nature, as if they have different laws of physics, which they obviously don't. Aristotle also thinks that the Earth has these laws of physics where things change, but in his opinion, planets in space are eternal and never change. So he thought that there's like a heaven where things don't change, and that the Earth is the center of the universe, and above it there's the heavens. So he artificially divides the universe into two parts, which the earliest materialists had not done. Moving on to medieval philosophy. In the Middle Ages, most of Aristotle's works go missing. A bunch of them are still missing to this day. Half of his Poetics is missing, so that's pretty annoying. Probably never be found, unfortunately. Aristotle, he actually originally wrote dialogues, just like Plato, but none of them have survived. All we have, like all his works that we have these days, they seem to be lecture notes for his lectures that he was giving in his school. And they might not even be written by him, even though they are his ideas, but they might be notes that somebody else wrote down based on what he was saying. So that's pretty annoying. So because a bunch of his works go missing, and generally there's a huge collapse of civilization when the Roman Empire falls and the Dark Ages begin, philosophy kind of goes back. Like already during the Roman Empire it was kind of stagnating. There was like Neo-Platonism, which is just Plato plus mystical beliefs and some other stuff, of course, but nothing as significant as Aristotle. And then in the Middle Ages, the influence of Aristotle diminishes and the influence of Plato increases. So the first really significant medieval philosopher is Saint Augustine, or Augustine of Hippo, from about 400 AD. He was a Christian, but he was also kind of a Neoplatonist, even though in the Middle Ages the main philosophical trend was scholasticism, which is really like a mix of Plato and Aristotle. And the works of Aristotle, at least a lot of them, especially a bunch of the works on logic, they are rediscovered later on in the Middle Ages because they survived in the Islamic world. So over time, the influence of Aristotle increases again, but especially early on, it's more Plato-influenced. Only at the very end of the Middle Ages, there's like Thomas Aquinas, who is clearly just a Christian Aristotelian. As far as I know, in the Middle Ages, philosophy doesn't really improve a whole lot. They work with the same Plato and Aristotle for like more than 1,000 years, but they don't rise above Aristotle at any point. In fact, they are inferior to Aristotle. Now, people might think that in the Middle Ages there is no struggle between idealism and materialism because everybody is just like all the philosophy is just talking about Christianity and whatnot. In a way that's true, but that's not entirely true. Even in Europe, the debate between materialism and idealism takes the form of the debate between what is called nominalism and what is called realism. And that's basically just the Aristotle-Plato debate. So the so-called realists, they think that concepts exist independently of the mind, so that, you know, the concept of a cat, like the form of a cat, it just exists on its own. Whereas the nominalists think that no, concepts are invented by people and they exist only in the minds of people. This nominalism and realism debate continues throughout the end of the Middle Ages, and I think a bunch of the early empiricists like Bacon still talked about it, but I'm not super familiar with that topic, and a comrade of mine said that the nominalism-realism debate later on wasn't really the same anymore, but I don't really know about that. After the Middle Ages, the two big philosophical trends are empiricism and rationalism, and these trends, they're all about like kind of theories of knowledge, like epistemology, how do you get knowledge. So rationalism says that if you just think about stuff, you'll figure it out. And then empiricism says that if you make observations, that's how you get knowledge. And the reason that these philosophical trends arise is because capitalism starts to emerge. Obviously, like, we're talking about like the 1500s and 1600s, so obviously this is still way before like the Industrial Revolution or anything like that. But science starts to develop, the bourgeoisie starts to develop, mechanics really starts to develop. There already are machines used in industrial production, machines like water mills and windmills, for instance. And astronomy really develops a lot, and I think that's why these epistemological questions come about. Aristotle's idea that the laws of physics that apply on Earth don't apply in space, eventually that's overthrown. Obviously, like in space, things are different, but, the laws of physics are the laws of physics. There's the same fundamental laws of physics. So that's one step closer to like an understanding of a one unified material world, instead of this world artificially split up into these two things that are just totally separate. Some people I've heard say that they think empiricism is materialist and rationalism is idealist. Well, in a certain sense that might be true, but in actual historical fact that is not true. In fact, there were both idealists and materialists in both the empiricist camp and the rationalist camp. So in the empiricist camp, obviously, like most of the big names like Bacon, Locke, Hobbes, they are materialists. A lot of them are not necessarily known for their materialism, partially because the bourgeoisie tries to hide that, but also because people focus more on their political philosophy. It's so strange, like libertarians these days, they always talk about Locke and how cool he is for like supporting capitalism. But Marxism also thinks that Locke was a really great philosopher. He was a materialist, he supported democracy, fought against feudalism. Of course, it's very reactionary to just support his views totally uncritically today as if they are not outdated. They are outdated, but they still have elements of truth, and it was a great advance for its own time. A lot of those ideas like social contract and this idea that there's like a state of nature, which is a state of chaos and violence and strife, and then the state emerges as a necessary evil that represses people, but it puts an end to the chaos and violence. That's obviously an influence of the British Civil War. Berkeley is a famous empiricist, but he is an idealist. And this is an example where you can clearly see how empiricism can become idealist. So Berkeley says that we can only trust our experience and nothing else. All we have is experience. So therefore he says that matter doesn't exist. He says that I can see a complex of sensations, or like a bundle of sensations, I think he calls it. I can see an apple, it's the color red, the taste, the texture of an apple, but there's no matter behind it. It's just a sensation in my senses, given by God. So he flat out denies the existence of the physical world and the material world completely. And indeed, if you think that only sensations are real, then that is idealist, because matter means an objective world, objectively existing world, meaning that it exists regardless of our sensations. It exists whether or not we like it, whether or not we know about it, regardless of what we think about it, it exists. The world existed before we did. The world existed already, and we only evolved later and then started getting sensations out of it. But for Berkeley, that's not the case. For him, there's just the sensations. The world doesn't exist. God just gives him sensations. Then in the rationalist camp, there's obviously Descartes. Descartes, a genius philosopher as well. He knew a lot about engineering and also about natural science, about astronomy. He develops basically a mechanical materialist outlook. He thinks that the world is basically material and works like clockwork. And he thinks that animals also work just like mechanical things. And he means that very literally. I think Descartes and his followers denied, I forget the term, it's like influence over distance, or what is it called? The thing where basically things can't impact each other if they don't touch each other. So he thought that even magnetism works because there's these tiny, tiny particles that cannot be seen. They're like magnetism particles, and that basically everything is constantly touching particles. So that magnetism is transmitted through magnetism particles. And yeah, everything, like gravity is because of gravity particles, like everything is just because of things touching each other and transmitting different effects. However, Descartes was actually a dualist. Monism means that you believe there is one philosophical substance. Philosophical substance means that it's a fundamental building block of existence and it's independent. It doesn't need anything else. So matter would be a philosophical substance, at least for a materialist. Materialists think that matter can exist independently. Materialists think that mind cannot exist independently. Mind is a product of matter, so mind is not a philosophical substance. For an idealist, it's the other way around. Mind exists independently, and then matter is a product of the mind, so matter is not independent of mind. Those are both monist because they think there's only one substance. But Descartes was a dualist. He thought that there's two independent substances, mind and matter, both exist, but they're both independent of each other. Meaning that, in his view, the world was a mechanical materialist world, but it was created by God, who is independent of the material world, and that there's also angels and things like that. And that people also have a soul which is given by God, and that the soul is not a product of the material world. That's very eclectic, and it's very inconsistent. Descartes is an interesting philosopher. He studied in a Jesuit school. They taught him scholasticism, and he hated it. He thought that it's terrible. Scholasticism is based on memorization and carrying out these very repetitive mechanical processes, like somebody makes an argument and then you recognize, oh, that is Aristotle's syllogism number 7 from his book Sophistical Elenchi, or whatever it's called. Because Aristotle had all these books where he just lists out correct arguments and also fallacies. So they would memorize all those and then they would practice them. Like somebody says an argument and then you recognize, oh, that's that argument, I know the refutation to that. But that kind of learning, it doesn't really use creative thinking, it's just memorization. It's sort of like pattern recognition and memorization. And there's a theory that reflects the medieval guild way of production. But Descartes rebelled against that, and he wanted to destroy it, he wanted to overthrow it. But as so often happens, he couldn't entirely. He wanted to overthrow this kind of neo-Aristotelian scholasticism, but his own philosophy is still very influenced by Aristotle. This whole thing that you need to have a prime mover and a first cause, and you need to have a God who creates everything and gets everything going, but then after that you don't really need God for anything. That's a very Aristotelian idea. I actually saw a lecture once which claimed that Descartes was a necessary transition stage for the development of natural science, because anything other than Descartes would have been too radical and the establishment would have been incapable of accepting it. Which that sounds plausible enough. Descartes is still similar enough to Aristotle. For example, as far as I know, Descartes didn't challenge the geocentric model, for instance. I think later dude named Tycho Brahe invents this hybrid model where the Earth rotates around the sun, but the planets rotate around the Earth, and then eventually with Galileo, I think they finally recognized that actually the Earth also rotates around the sun. And they also recognize action at a distance, that things don't have to be touching to impact other things. So the fact that Descartes was able to develop mechanical materialist understanding of the material world, that's of course a product of the fact that machinery was being developed. He was very aware of engineering techniques. In fact, he was, I think in the 30 Years' War, he was an engineer. So he knew all about water wheels and pumps used in mining and those kinds of things, mechanical machines. Descartes was a rationalist, of course, but he wasn't actually against using empirical knowledge. He was very interested in natural science, so he was all about using empirical knowledge, but he thought that the fundamental things you can figure out just based on deduction. So people think that Descartes actually doubted the existence of everything, but it's only methodological doubt. He says okay, for the sake of argument, I'm going to say that I don't trust my senses. So then what's left? And he says well, at least I know that I exist because I think, therefore I am. And then from there he tries to bring everything back. He tries to then justify how we still can actually do science. His philosophy runs into this radical problem of dualism, this if God is not material, how can God impact the material world? And that's actually a problem in religion as a whole. There's been a lot of different attempts to try to solve that. In some, like especially esoteric religions and esoteric beliefs, there's this idea of emanation, which means that God has to assume like more and more imperfect and more material forms in order to interact with the world. Like God can't go down on earth, he has to send an angel or something. Or God has to incarnate as a man like Jesus or something, because God is too holy to go down on earth and like do stuff with matter. But emanation doesn't actually fix that. It's just creating more steps, so it seems like it fixes it. But Descartes also couldn't really fix that, couldn't really explain it. He said that animals don't have a soul, and that animals are just clockwork machines. But he said that humans do have a soul, so humans have a free will. But he couldn't explain, well, if the soul is immaterial and the body is material, how can they interact? He said that humans have this thing in their brain called the pineal gland, and that somehow does it, but that's not really a good explanation. It's called the mind-body problem. But one of his successors, Spinoza, he was also a Cartesian, but he was a materialist. He got rid of this dualism business and just transformed it into monism, and primarily to fix this problem of dualism. You see this actually repeat again later in the history of philosophy. So Spinoza said that actually there's only one substance, but it has two aspects, and one of them is the material aspect, and the other one is the mind aspect or the spiritual aspect. And Spinoza was also a pantheist. That's why a lot of people think that he was an idealist, because he talks about things kinda in a religious or mystical way, but that's just appearance. The actual essence of it is materialism. And again, this is like just reactionary capitalist distortion. They try to eliminate materialism from the history of philosophy. They never tell you that the first philosophers were materialists. They don't tell you that a lot of the empiricists were materialists. They don't tell you that Spinoza was a materialist. And then when it comes to the later materialists, like the French materialists of the 18th century and then Feuerbach, they just don't talk about those at all. I wonder why. So Spinoza, he says that the world and God are the same thing. So there is no problem like how can God impact the world. He just says nature and God are the same. Problem solved. And he says that we don't need like a prime mover. We don't need a first cause. Like the earliest philosophers, they thought that the world had always existed. They thought that the world is eternal. That doesn't need any kind of creator. With Aristotle and Descartes and the Middle Ages, that gets lost. But then Spinoza brings it back. He says that actually the world doesn't need any outside creator. The world is its own cause and it's self-moving. So that is a brilliant materialist view of the universe. And it's absolutely true. It still holds up. It's still true to this day. And these days, like, there's a lot of people who say that the universe came into existence because of the Big Bang. Well, be that as it may, the Big Bang didn't really create matter. It already existed in some form before that. Anybody who tells you that the world had a beginning is only trying to justify religious superstition. It's only trying to justify the idea that the world was created by God. In actuality, the world is eternal. So Spinoza, materialist thinker, a dialectical thinker. I'm not knowledgeable enough to say, but I think maybe he thought that the two aspects of the one philosophical substance, the material aspect and the mind aspect, maybe he thought that those are both equally important. Okay, moving on. So to Hume. Hume was another empiricist, but I kinda keep him separate in his own category. Hume lived in the 1700s. Really, Hume is mostly known as an agnostic, subjective idealist. So in this story that I've told, so far everybody's been an objective idealist. Like Parmenides, Plato, they all thought that the world is spiritual, the world was created by God, like God runs everything. Berkeley is a subjective idealist because he thinks that the world is just in your own mind, even though he's not fully consistent with that. Like Berkeley is the guy who said if a tree falls and there's nobody to see it, it doesn't make a sound. But then, because things happen, and even when people don't see them happen, he says, well, God sees it happen, so he says that everything has to be observed all the time and the only one who can do it is God. So he's primarily a subjective idealist, but to make it work, he still has to like kind of introduce an objective idealist element in the form of God, even though, of course, the whole point of his thing was to justify religion. But Hume, he is a subjective idealist and an agnostic. He basically says that we should recognize that we can't get a whole lot of knowledge. We can get ideas based on sensations and then we can analyze them and compare them, but that's not really getting us very close to the truth. And he says that even something like cause and effect can't really be proven. You can like drop something a million times and it always drops, but that doesn't actually prove that there is such a thing as cause and effect. Like, it doesn't prove that you dropping it makes it drop. It could just be a coincidence. One time you could do it and it doesn't drop, it just floats. He says like the day follows the night and the night follows the day, and like winter follows summer. That doesn't mean that winter is caused by summer or that the day is caused by the night, which of course is true. They're caused by like the earth rotating and moving, but of course it's not really a coincidence. I'm only really talking about Hume kind of as a precursor to Kant. So jumping ahead, Kant lived from 1724 to 1804. He was one of the classical German philosophers, classical German idealists, even though he wasn't a completely consistent idealist. Kant started out being very much a philosopher of nature. He studied science. He actually invented the theory of cosmic evolution. There's a thing called the Kant-Laplace hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that the planets formed, I think, from a nebula. Basically that there was like hot dust or hot gas or something, and then it formed into planets. So he was a very smart guy, and I think he was a rationalist, but then when he read Hume, he changed his mind completely. He said that there's dogmatic philosophy, and I think by that he means rationalism, which just believes certain things because they seem logical and then makes deductions. And then he says that there's critical philosophy, which is like this super skeptic, agnostic philosophy. But he doesn't take agnosticism to the same extreme as Hume. Instead, Lenin says that when Kant is talking about nature, he's a materialist, and when Kant recognizes that the objective world exists, he's being a materialist. But then Kant says that even though the world exists, we can't get any firm knowledge about it. Then Lenin says that that's idealist. When he denies the knowability of the world, he's being an idealist. So Kant kinda, again, splits the world into two. He says that there's the world and then there's our experience, and since we can only gain knowledge through our own experience, therefore we can really only know our own experience and we can't know the real world. That there's no necessary connection between the world, how it really is, and our experience. But, well, I think the flaw is there. Like, of course there has to be a connection. Our experience must somehow at least roughly correspond to how the world actually is. Obviously not perfectly, and our understanding of the world gradually becomes better so that our understanding corresponds to the reality of the world better and better over time. But he says that there's no necessary connection between how the world is and how we think it is. And he still thinks that we should do science and we can do whatever, but we just have to recognize that we can't ever get to the real truth. But I think he's thinking about truth too metaphysically. He's thinking like there's absolute truth. Whereas Marxism says, yeah, you can't ever get to absolute truth. It's not possible. You can only get closer to it, but you can't ever get to absolute truth. Objective truth exists, like the real truth exists, but the world is infinite and things happen all the time. You can't ever get all the knowledge because it's infinite, but you can keep getting better and getting more knowledge and refining the knowledge. And we do have a subjective experience and the world is objective, but our subjective knowledge or our subjective ideas, they either correspond to the objective world or they don't. If they do, then that's called true knowledge, and if they don't, that's false ideas. I guess I didn't really talk about morality a whole lot in this video, but basically in ancient Greece and in the Middle Ages they had virtue ethics, so they thought that there's certain kinds of virtues and then you have to follow those. Kant says that there's like certain kind of moral obligation that you just have to always do what's right, but really the problem with all those systems of ethics is that they're supposed to be the same ethics for all people and for all times, and that's why people can't ever really follow them. Even the most basic ones, like thou shalt not kill. Well, people kill each other all the time. And, throughout history, it's been considered justified to kill people all the time, even though it's supposed to be banned. In war, you were allowed to kill people, you were allowed to execute people, or thou shalt not steal. Well, people steal all the time. So that's why Marxism says that actually morality changes historically. Like slavery used to be considered moral, now it's considered immoral. That's because the world changes. And Marxism obviously thinks that slavery is wrong, but there was a time when it was kind of unavoidable. Marxism thinks that slavery was an advance compared to the previous kind of society where enemies were just killed. And serfdom is better than slavery, and then capitalism is an advance compared to the Middle Ages, but capitalism is also oppressive. Marxism basically says that the same kind of morality cannot exist for slaves and slave owners. Like, the slaves think that it's wrong that they're treated badly. The slave owners think it's right. They're both correct in their own way. The objective truth is more on the side of the slaves, but they both basically have a different morality. One of them is more true than the other one, but those are the real moralities that they actually follow, not any kind of shared morality. Of course, there are elements of morality that they both share, like that justice is good, but the way they understand justice is totally different. So that's kind of the problem with Kant's, like this idea that there's like a shared morality that everybody has and it's supposed to be eternal for all times. Kant is one of the most complicated and difficult philosophers probably in the history of philosophy. My grasp of Kant is not all that great, but I will talk a little bit about Kant's antinomies. He came up with this idea of antinomies, which are like mutually incompatible notions, but that they still both exist, and that it's like an unsolvable paradox. He says that like free will and causality are an example of such a paradox, and he says that it's like equally valid to say that free will exists or that it doesn't. He says that the limitation of the universe in respect to space and time is an antinomy. I don't remember the argument of why that is, but in any case, I'm only bringing that up because that problem leads us eventually to Hegel. So Kant is followed by Schelling and Fichte, and Kant is like an inconsistent idealist, kinda. Schelling tries to take it into an objective idealist direction to solve it. And I think like the free will and causality thing can also be seen like that. Like if you are a subjective idealist, you might say, well, my free will is the only thing that exists and causality doesn't. And if you are an objective idealist, you might say causality exists, everything is determined by God, you don't have a free will or whatnot. So Schelling tries to take it into an objective idealist direction and solve it, and Fichte takes it into a subjective idealist direction, tries to solve it. But then Hegel comes along, and this is one of the reasons why Hegel is able to come up with modern dialectics, the idea that there are a unity of opposites, there's two mutually exclusive things that still require each other, and even though they're contradictory, they're still both true, but it's not an unsolvable contradiction the way Kant's antinomies are, where Kant says you have to choose one, but no matter which you choose, it's kind of wrong or kind of correct either way. But Hegel says, no, they're both true. You don't really have to choose. Like, is motion a contradiction? Well, yes, but that doesn't mean the motion is not real. I'm not really going to talk a lot about Hegel because I think Marxists are more familiar with Hegel. But obviously, like, Hegel is an objective idealist, but he thinks that the spirit, the world spirit, like, evolves first, is alienated from itself and then comes to know itself, and it has this like evolutionary process, and through dialectical change. Hegel writes like in the late 1700s, early 1800s. I guess I'll say something about Rousseau. I've talked mostly about like ontology and theories of knowledge. Rousseau, he's more like a political philosopher, I guess. Like, he believes that there's like a social contract and you should do things based on reason. But Rousseau also has dialectical elements in his thinking. He says that, I think Engels quotes him in Anti-During, where Rousseau says that, like, progress, at the same time, it's a good thing, but it also causes more inequality. A lot of people seem to think that Rousseau thought that the state of nature is like great, but that's not necessarily true. He just thought that civilization has brought inequality, whereas the state of nature was more equal, but civilization is still progress. So that's a dialectical view of progress, how it's a good thing, but it's also contradictory because it causes like suffering at the same time. But then eventually it can be solved. And Rousseau was very influential for French Revolution. In the 1800s in France, there were revolutionary radical materialists. They're usually left out from history of philosophy. I was never taught this in school, but Diderot, Helvetius, Holbach, Lemaitre, they were mechanical materialists. They were atheists. They thought that the world functions based on material laws and material causes. However, because they were metaphysical materialists, mechanical materialists, they were not able to use materialism consistently. They were unable to solve the problem of free will and causality. So they either thought that the only thing that changes the world is ideas invented through free will. That's an idealist explanation because you have to explain where the ideas come from. Or they did the opposite, which is to say that everything changes purely because of material determinism and that ideas don't matter at all. And at that point, it's kind of difficult to justify, like, well, what's the point of even talking about this then? Marxism, because of Hegel, was eventually able to discover that free will and causality are contradictory, but they both kind of exist. They just exist like kind of in a limited way, in the sense that causality exists. Ideas are born from material conditions, but people can use ideas to change material conditions. And, Marxism has this definition of freedom, that freedom is conscious necessity or recognition of necessity, so that if you know what is necessary, if you know where progress is going, then you can consciously follow that and you can consciously try to advance that. And then you are going with progress. You are not obstructed. You are completely free. You're consciously, deliberately acting and you are going the same way that history is going. You're free, in a sense. But if you don't know how the world works, then that means you're completely the slave of, just like the slave of determinism, slave of destiny. Stuff just happens to you, you don't know why, and you can't change it. You can't do anything. Sometimes by coincidence, you might be doing the right thing, but sometimes by coincidence, you're doing the wrong thing, you don't know. So at that point, you're not free. And if you try to consciously resist progress, then you're really not free, because you're just fighting an impossible battle. So freedom is the recognition of necessity. If you understand how the world works, then the better your understanding, the more free you are, and the more you're able to act in accordance with it, and the more you're able to consciously apply physical laws and scientific laws and economic laws and whatnot, and use them to the advantage of humanity. So free will does not exist in the sense that you don't have to follow physical laws or something. That doesn't exist. That's just mumbo jumbo. But free will does exist in the sense that you can discover how the world works and then you can act deliberately based on those findings. And that ideas do change the world, but ideas don't fall from the sky. So the French materialists, they are significant. They were influential for Marx and Engels as well. And then Feuerbach, the last of the classic German philosophers, although he's not usually included because he's a materialist and the capitalists usually leave him out. But Feuerbach, he used to be a Hegelian, but he began criticizing Hegel's idealism and he debunked Hegel's idealism. He was one of the crucial influences that influenced Marx and Engels to become materialists. But Feuerbach, unfortunately, when he abandoned idealism, he also abandoned dialectics, and then he tried to develop his own philosophical system. His ethical views that he tried to develop, they suffer from idealism, and he also couldn't apply materialism to politics and economics and history, because that's only possible through dialectical materialism, and he abandoned dialectics, so he couldn't do that. Of course, then Marx and Engels, they developed dialectical materialism. They're able to apply materialism for the first time consistently to nature and to human thought and to society. So dialectical materialism, it applies to all three things, to nature, to thought, and society. There was a movement contemporary with Marx and Engels known as vulgar materialism. Vulgar materialism still exists to this day, and it basically means kind of this dumbed down materialism which ignores qualitative differences. It tries to reduce things too far. For example, saying that economics is just biology or something, or economics is just physics. Well, that's vulgar materialism. There's physical laws, chemical laws. When life emerges, you get biological laws. Physical laws apply to living things, but living things also have their own laws doing complicated stuff. And then when consciousness arises, you have laws of consciousness, like how thinking happens, psychological laws. And then when society emerges, you have economic laws. You simply cannot reduce supply and demand to like a biological law. You can't reduce the development of the productive forces to like a physical law, even though people have tried. Okay, then I guess we get to sort of the decay of capitalist philosophy. Up to this point, like ever since like the rationalists and empiricists, it's been like just more and more advanced, just the capitalist, the bourgeois philosophy just progressing, getting better. But from this point on, it kind of starts going downhill, so I'm not going to get to everything. I guess I'll just talk about, there's basically three big trends in bourgeois philosophy, especially in the bourgeois philosophy of the imperialist period, the latest stage of capitalism, the final stage of capitalism, when capitalism reaches its peak and then starts going downhill. And these are broadly the following: irrationalism, Neo-positivism, and other pseudo-scientific philosophies, and then there's religious philosophy. Religious philosophy is the least important. There's really nothing interesting in modern-day religious philosophy. The most significant trends are just rehashing of the philosophy of the Middle Ages, like just bringing back Thomas Aquinas from the Middle Ages and just doing stuff based on that. That just shows how like stagnant that kind of philosophy is. Neo-positivism and pseudo-scientific or like fake scientific philosophy, that's very widespread. I'm not really gonna talk about like original positivism, but neo-positivism, there's many different varieties of it, but they're all fundamentally the same. Neo-positivism is also called neo-empiricism, and it's basically Berkeley, but they pretend that it's not. They say like, oh yeah, we are so scientific, we don't trust anything except observations and math. But then that just means that they only use sensations and they deny that the world exists, or they deny that the world is cognizable or knowable. Because, of course, you can't mathematically prove that the material world exists. You can't mathematically prove that matter exists. You can't observe matter. Matter is an objective reality. It exists regardless of our experience. But neo-positivism only accepts experience. So if you only believe in observations, then you literally think that the stuff you're not observing probably doesn't exist, or might not exist, or at least you have to remain agnostic about whether or not it exists. So the world didn't exist before we got experience of it. Of course, they'll come up with some kind of excuse. They'll say, oh, we found a fossil, therefore it proves that the world existed. Well, okay, but what if we didn't have the fossil? Then you would say that the world didn't exist? Well, actually, they probably wouldn't even say that, because even if you find a fossil, that really doesn't prove that the world exists to them, because to neo-positivists, it just proves that you have an experience of a fossil. But the whole point is that they think it's unscientific to assume that there is anything behind the experience. So that's why neo-positivism is just subjective idealism, but it's masquerading as if it's scientific. It's actually very widespread in scientific circles, especially like ever since like the 60s it started to be like pretty much mainstream. Lenin debunks neo-positivism in his book Materialism and Empiricism. One of the things that really demonstrates how like neo-positivism is an ideology of capitalism that is in crisis and decay, and like a crisis-ridden and stagnant philosophy, is that neo-positivism says that all that philosophy can do is take observations that natural science has given us, and then it can arrange those into like arguments or equations or formulae, which that's really narrowing the scope of philosophy. Like Lenin said that to the huge credit of Spinoza, for example, that Spinoza was able to go so much beyond what the science of his day was capable of doing. And same goes for like Heraclitus, for instance. Heraclitus realized that the world is infinite and material, even though there was no science in his day to demonstrate that. And I suppose even to this day, science probably can't demonstrate that the world is infinite. I don't know how you would demonstrate that. Mainstream capitalist science believes that the universe is expanding, but not that it's infinite. And basically, Neo-positivism says that questions like, does the world exist? Or is the world material? They would say that that's an unanswerable question, or that it's basically an invalid or a stupid question, and that philosophy can't answer it. Nobody should ask such questions. So they keep narrowing what philosophy is supposed to do and what it can do. And they do that in all fields of philosophy. So that demonstrates how much of a stagnant and crisis-ridden philosophy it is. It's powerless to answer anything. And it keeps diminishing the field of philosophy, and that's why people rebel against it and then turn to other terrible solutions. Neo-positivism eventually leads to the complete abandonment of philosophy. It leads to what is called scientism, or science worship, or like science, science idolatry, which is the naive belief that science can explain everything without philosophy. What's the meaning of life? And then you have a computer that says like 42 or something, as if science could explain such a question. And when I say science, I mean like natural science. Philosophy, of course, can be scientific and should be scientific, but philosophy deals with different kinds of more abstract and more higher level generalizations than any specific specialized science. Like dialectics says that the world develops based on contradictions. That's a very general statement. None of the special sciences like physics, chemistry, biology, or even math, like they don't talk about those kinds of things. One variant of neo-positivism is philosophy of Karl Popper, even though Karl Popper is not really a positivist, but he's kind of an anti, or not an anti, but he's kind of a reverse neo-positivist. Because positivism says that you can only believe in things that you can directly observe or experience or use math to demonstrate. Popper says kind of the same thing, but just kind of like turned inside out. Neo-positivism has a verification method. They say if you can verify something, then we can accept it. But Popper says that nothing can be verified, things can only be falsified. So he says that everything is questionable or false. He says we can falsify things, we can prove that something is false, or we can say that we're uncertain. And that's, of course, fundamentally flawed. By that logic, we could test something a million times, but it's still not reliable. It might turn out to be completely untrue in the end. And he's saying that because he thinks of truth again, like so metaphysically, he's thinking about absolute truth. Well, since we can't get absolute perfect knowledge, therefore everything is uncertain, which is just dumb as hell. And also, the falsification thing is just untrue, because he thinks that, oh yeah, we have Newtonian physics, and then there's some flaws in it, and then it gets updated into Einsteinian physics. That shows that Newton was wrong all along. Well, that's not true. He was mostly correct. And then Popper says that Newton is supposed to be discarded, but that's not true. Newtonian physics is still used widely, more widely than Einsteinian physics, because it still has elements of truth in it. I really don't like Popper, and I don't like neo-positivism. They don't think like human beings. They think like a computer from the 90s. You have to give them the exact correct term, otherwise it just says like syntax error, doesn't work, does not compute, and then it doesn't work. Like it's either perfect or it's nothing. But that's not how it works. That's not how reality is. Karl Popper is also just a general, like, huge reactionary whose views on politics and history and philosophy are just idiotic beyond belief. Like, he thinks philosophy divides into democratic and totalitarian. He says that, like, Plato and Marx are in the same totalitarian camp, and then I don't know, somebody else is in the democratic camp, which is again just dumb as hell. He doesn't see like any kind of historical progress. It's just democracy and tyranny. No like relatively more democratic or less democratic, or democratic for its time, or like democratic for this or democratic for that. It's just very abstract, like blanket flat out democracy or flat out tyranny, no nuance. And Karl Popper also said that history can never be a science. History should not be a science. You cannot predict anything based on what has happened previously, because if you try to do that, it leads to Marxism and then it leads to tyranny, which is, again, just dumb as hell. And the arguments, like how he tries to justify that view, I'm not going to get into it, but they're really poor. It basically boils down to the fact that predicting history is difficult, but, there's no reason to assume that it's impossible. He generally believes that nothing can be known for sure, or even roughly. We can only be uncertain, or we can be certain that something is false, but we can never be even remotely certain that something is true. All these philosophies that try to deny that truth exists, or that the world is knowable, that truth exists, or that we can gain truth or knowledge, they're all reflections of the crisis-ridden nature of late-stage capitalism. Okay, so then the third kind of bourgeois philosophy in the modern era is irrationalism. So that's a very broad term, but it kind of starts with like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and there's many different kinds of irrationalism, but the main point of it is that the world is unexplainable and, fundamentally irrational. For Nietzsche, there is a sort of irrational, innate will to power. If you have the will to power, then nothing can stop you. Laws of physics don't hinder you. You have absolute free will, which is just manic. Schopenhauer, same kind of thing. He says that people have this innate desire to live, even though he thinks that existence is suffering and that the world is just full of illusions and you can't know anything about anything and everything is bad. There's different variations of it, like Bergson and Husserl, and then Kierkegaard and existentialism. Nietzsche is sometimes considered an existentialist. Kierkegaard is sometimes considered an existentialist, but I don't really think so. Kierkegaard has this idea that you have to make a leap of faith. You have to just believe things for no reason. But I'm not really that well read on Kierkegaard, so I'm not really going to say a lot about that yet. I'm reading a book about irrationalism right now, but I haven't finished it. Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, they all deny historical progress and they all deny like scientific history. They all resist Hegel's dialectics, which says that there's like a historical progress. Schopenhauer denies dialectics altogether, whereas Kierkegaard tries to distort dialectics. Kind of an important idea of irrationalism is this subject-object of philosophy, which means that you can like unify the subject and the object, but that's a fundamentally unscientific idealist concept. Like there's the objective world and then you have a subjective experience, but you can't ever eliminate the distinction between them. You can have subjective knowledge that roughly corresponds to the objective world, but you can't eliminate the distinction between them. Existentialism, it really starts, I guess, with Heidegger. There were all kinds of, existentialists were actually all kinds of different political views, like Heidegger was a Nazi. In the post-World War II France, Camus and Sartre were leftists, almost communists, but they were existentialists. But they said all kinds of stupid things like existentialism is for everybody, like you can be a monarchist or a fascist or a communist and it's the same philosophy for everybody. Like obviously that's anti-Marxist. Point of existentialism is that you can only kind of know your own experience and that you are constantly afraid of death. The question of to exist or not to exist and like what happens when you don't exist. That's like the main question of philosophy, and that you can only study it subjectively, not based on any kind of scientific methods. That's also a form of irrationalism. It became very fashionable in like the late 40s and 50s. There's also other kinds of like fashionable bourgeois imperialist philosophies that were popular like a little bit before existentialism, like pragmatism was one. Pragmatism was mostly in America. Pragmatism is also irrationalist. It says that truth does not exist, or it doesn't matter what the truth is, that you should believe things that are useful. And some people say that Marxism is pragmatic, but that's completely false. Like, Marxism thinks that some ideas are progressive because they have a better truth content, they have more truthful content. The idea itself can be like a little bit wrong, like the Enlightenment ideas, for instance, they were not really true, or the ideas of the French Revolution, like liberty, fraternity, equality. Like, of course, it's not absolute liberty, it's really it's free trade, and it's not really true equality, it's only nominal equality, but it's still better than feudalism, it's better than not even having nominal equality. Or like the ideas of the religious reformation, those ideas were not really true, but they were fighting against feudalism in the form of the Catholic Church, fighting for progress, so they were more correct than the opposite ideas. And in those conditions, it was not really possible to have like a truly scientific worldview, so the ideas that they had were like good for their time. So that's not the same as pragmatism, which says that the truth is completely arbitrary, you can just believe whatever you want. That's why pragmatism says that, oh yeah, if believing in God is useful, then go ahead. And all these like fake scientific philosophies, like even Neo-positivism says that God is not a question that philosophy can deal with, so God is compatible with Neo-positivism. You can believe superstitions on your free time, and then you can go to work and work in a laboratory and mess around with chemicals and do natural science. Again, if I'm wrong about some of these things, or if you think I'm wrong, feel free to tell me. I'm willing to discuss it. I'm also learning more about these things and studying these things, so I'm probably making mistakes all over the place, but it's a bit annoying to me that sometimes people, they have a favorite philosopher, like Nietzsche might be somebody's favorite philosopher, and then they just get angry when somebody says that Nietzsche is a reactionary. Or somebody says like, existentialism is cool, and then if somebody says that it's anti-Marxist, they just get angry about it. Well, what am I supposed to do? Like, when I was in middle school, I used to read Nietzsche. I didn't understand anything that he said, but I was still reading it because I thought it was cool and edgy. After that, I was reading Schopenhauer, so I was literally reading like some of the worst like products of capitalism in decay. But I got over it. I wasn't really ever that into Nietzsche, but I was into Schopenhauer for a little bit. Although that was before I was really interested in politics, and that was before I was a Marxist, obviously, but still. Okay, then lastly, this is a bit odd, like, how there's continental and analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy means basically like Neo-positivism and Karl Popper and those kinds of things. Some neo-positivists like Wittgenstein and those kinds of people, they only want to talk about like language. They say that philosophy can only talk about language. They say that all philosophical problems are just because of confusing language, that if we just figure out the language and make it precise, then all the problems are solved. Everything that can't be solved like that must just be a stupid question that is the product of imprecise language. So some of them are more like science-oriented, some of them are more like semantics and linguistics oriented, and some of them are more like logic oriented. That's called analytic philosophy. And then other stuff is just called continental philosophy. Everything else is just called continental philosophy, which is really, to me, that's a really stupid terminology. Like, oh yeah, in the UK they do analytic, and then on the continent they do existentialism and whatnot. So that's just called continental philosophy. But obviously modern day, these days, there's also like postmodernism and post-structuralism. I have to admit, I have not really studied those things. I don't really know a whole lot about post-structuralism, postmodernism. I'll say a couple things, but correct me if I'm wrong. Because I was trying to think, like, do they fit into any of those three categories? Well, they obviously don't fit into the religious category. Do they fit into the pseudoscientific category, or do they fit into the irrationalist category? And I think maybe in the irrationalist, or maybe they just don't fit into any of those categories. But when postmodernism says that there's no quote-unquote meta-narratives, and that there's no like objective truth, that everybody has their own truth, that's kind of irrationalist to me. But postmodernism is not all wrong. When postmodernism criticizes like Eurocentrism, or I don't know, like heteronormativeness, that's fine. I think that's correct, but they just take it too far. It turns into its opposite. Like when they say like, okay, this is from a book I read, I'll link it in the description, but like when they say like, we shouldn't teach like the indigenous people in India about science and democracy and technology because those are just Western colonialist ideas. A, that's reactionary because those ideas are actually good ideas that are universally good. B, that's just false. And C, that in and of itself is like a Eurocentric, like white supremacist idea. Like to go to some country that still has like feudalism or slavery or something and then go to them and say, oh, you don't have democracy, you don't have women's rights, you don't have science. That's good because you are just like that. That's not the case. Science is not inherently European. The Middle East used to be way more advanced than Europe. They were far more advanced in terms of science than Europeans were. It's not a white colonialist idea. So this idea that everything is like relative, that becomes irrationalist if it's taken to an extreme, if it's taken like one-sidedly. Everything is relative, but only relatively. You know, even though that's kind of a funny thing to say, but everything is not absolutely relative. But yeah, that's my long rambling discussion of the history of philosophy. As you can see, there's some stuff I know and then there's some stuff that I don't know. I have to keep studying, but it's a big topic. There's a lot of stuff out there. Humans have come up with a lot of ideas. Hopefully this was at least a little bit helpful and maybe an introduction to some of these ideas and how Marxists see them.